Dead Island 2 is on its way, with the release date of April 21st being pushed forward by a week after the game went gold. This shows us that it's basically ready for release, and as we do get closer to this release, we've been going over the best things about Dead Island 2, and I have already done a video going over the best things about the game, and I'll link that in the description below and at the end of the video. But in today's video, we'll be switching things up a bit. We'll be going over the worst things about Dead Island 2. Now, before we do get into all of that, I do want to say that I don't think this will be a bad game. It does look like a brilliant game, and I'm really looking forward to Dead Island 2. However, obviously there are going to be a few negative things, of course, just like any video game ever. So in this video, we'll be going over the things that seem slightly more negative about Dead Island 2. Obviously not telling you that the game is bad, since it's hopefully not going to be bad, but just looking at a few things that you might want to be a bit skeptical about before the game does release. So in today's video, we'll be going over the worst things about Dead Island 2. Let's waste no more time and let's get straight into the video. So the first point is sort of negative, but also very positive at the same time, and that is that the game will be on the last generation consoles. Now, typically when a game releases on both PlayStation 5 and PlayStation 4, along with the Series X and S and Xbox One, it generally feels like they aren't utilizing all of the power of the next generation consoles, because they're having to optimize the game and also think about the older consoles. Now, with Dead Island 2, the game will be releasing, like I mentioned, on those older consoles, so it's possible that they won't be utilizing all of the power of those next generation consoles, since they're having to make sure that the game will somewhat run on the older consoles. Of course, it will be 30 frames per second, we obviously all know it will be, but you know, it may mean that it could have been slightly better on the next generation consoles if it wasn't releasing on the older ones. However, at the same time, of course, with it releasing on the older consoles, it means that more people get to play the game, of course, which is obviously the better thing, really. At the end of the day, that's probably the better option for it to be maybe slightly worse than it would have been on the next generation consoles, but to still release on the older consoles. Of course, the developers would argue that either way it's going to be the same on next generation consoles, and maybe that is the case. We don't really know as a player, but it could be possible that if it didn't release on those older consoles, it would just be slightly better of an experience on next generation. But either way, it will be releasing on the older consoles, so you can take that as a bad thing or a good thing, depending on the generation of console that you play on, really. So next up is that the game isn't realistic, and it's not really a bad thing, I suppose. Some people might not see it as a bad thing, but others that like realistic games probably won't like Dead Island 2 that much. It's a zombie game, and obviously zombie games aren't going to be 100% realistic. Of course, it's set in the real world, if that makes sense, but of course with the environment that it's in, it's not very realistic at all. But either way, that doesn't mean that it won't be fun, and it doesn't mean it's going to be a bad game at all. Just something that for some people might not make a great game. If they like realistic games, then Dead Island 2 might not be for them. But yeah, like I did mention, this really won't make it a bad game at all. It's just not 100% realistic, of course. And next up is that the combat is great, and well, you're probably thinking, well, that should be in the best things video, and it is, but of course it does seem great. That doesn't mean it's going to be great. Of course, our expectations are going to be pretty high for the combat in the game. The interactions seem very good, but I'm going to get onto the interactions in a minute. But generally speaking, it all seems great, and it seems like the combat's going to work very well, or at least hopefully. With it being so sort of smooth, and with animations being so set on what they are, this could create a couple bugs within the game. Of course, if you need to have a certain animation for a kill to actually happen, then maybe there may be a chance that animation doesn't play and you don't actually kill the zombie, which could be, you know, that could result in quite a few issues. So hopefully the combat will work well, and it will work just like it does within the gameplay reveal, and I have done a full analysis of that, link in the description below. Hopefully it will work like it does in the trailers, but if it doesn't, that's going to be very disappointing. So not really a worst thing about the game, I suppose, but of course it's something to definitely be skeptical about, because maybe the combat won't work as well when it does release. But hopefully it will work as well, and we'll be getting some great combat. But I do just want to talk about the interactions. Unfortunately, there are set animations for kills, so this could be a good thing and this could be a bad thing. Whilst it seems like a good thing, it could be really clean and make the combat really exciting. It could make it very slow paced, and it could also mean it gets pretty repetitive. There's not going to be loads and loads of animations. There will be quite a few, but there's not going to be hundreds and thousands, which could mean it will get pretty repetitive, since I assume you'll be killing thousands of zombies within Dead Island 2. So if you only have a couple animations to go off, then it's going to get pretty repetitive, and it might not be very fast paced. There may be certain buttons you have to click during animations for kills, meaning that it could be quite slow to just kill one zombie. Maybe that won't be the case, and maybe it'll be some classic hack and slash. Hopefully there will be a bit of that mixed in with some animations for finishing kills and stuff like that. Hopefully, yeah, there will be a good mix of stuff, but of course if it isn't, then that's going to be a pretty bad thing about the game. The combat could be quite slow and maybe pretty repetitive, which could be a pretty big flaw, but like I said, hopefully that won't be the case and it will all work very smoothly. Next up is that the story probably won't be that good. Now, when it comes to Dead Island Island games, the story isn't really the main part of the game. It's the general gameplay and the general theme of the game that is the main focus. The story is probably going to be pretty generic, maybe, not the most exciting and not the most thrilling, but of course the story will be there for those that want it. It's probably not going to, be the best and most thrilling story that we've ever seen before, but hopefully it will just be decent. So, it's something to go off when you are playing through the game, and something to just walk through, and just a bit of progression that you do have along the way, and just something to work towards. Now, I assume that this story isn't going to be amazing. Hopefully I am wrong. Hopefully this story will blow us all away and it's going to be outstanding, but I just can't see that being the case. Of course, the story is never going to be the main focus with a game like this. It's going to be the general gameplay, but of course the story could be quite good with the Dying Light games. Some people say they find the story pretty good with those games, so maybe with Dead Island 2, with it being a much more modern game, the story is going to be pretty strong. Hopefully that's the case, but if it isn't, then that's definitely one of the worst things about the game, is that the story isn't that thrilling. So the next thing is the size of the map. We really don't know how big this map will be. It could be quite small and compact, but that might not be a bad thing at all. This could mean that it's a pretty dense area full with loads of stuff to do and places to see, but it could also mean that it'll be a massive open area with not much going on, or we might get something good in between, where we're getting a decent sized map with loads going on in that map. So hopefully we'll be getting something good there, but if we don't, then that's definitely going to be one of the bad things about the game, is that the map really doesn't have much going for it, but hopefully that won't be the case when the game does release. So before we talk a bit about the development of the game, which I'm sure a lot of you are expecting to be here, we'll talk about the co-op being part of the game with Dead Island 2. Dead Island 2 was originally set to have an 8-player co-op, which is doubling what we had with the original Dead Island game and the Riptide game, so that would be a massive improvement, something we'd expect with obviously the game being newer and a sequel to the previous game. We would expect it to be improved upon, but this ended up not being the case and actually becoming a downgrade. We'll be going from a 4-player co-op with the older games to a 3-player co-op. At least we are still getting co-op, of course, but they did promise an 8-player co-op, and this has gone down to just 3 players. Of course, it's still there for 3 people, but it would be nice to at least have 4. Of course, if they kept it at 4, then that wouldn't be too bad, since 4 is really fine and that's to be expected. 8 would have been amazing. That is really going above and beyond, so we can't always expect that, but to then go away from 8 and then go down to 3 is really disappointing, and definitely one of the worst parts about the game, and especially when it comes to the multiplayer co-op, since of course it's being downgraded from the original game, but at least of course it is still there for players to use. Then finally, we of course have the development of the game. The game was originally set to release in 2015, so we're just about 8 years after that, but at least it is arriving now. It's definitely one of the worst parts, is the development for the game has been very messy, but hopefully that won't affect the end product, and we're going to be getting an amazing game when Dead Island 2 does release on the 21st of April of 2023. And that does just about wrap up things here. Those were the worst things about Dead Island 2. Of course, not saying it's a bad game, since I really hope it won't be a bad game, and it doesn't look like it will be, but that was just some of the negative parts about the game, and some stuff to be a bit skeptical about before the game does release on the 21st of April. So that does just about wrap up things here. Now, like I mentioned earlier on in the video, I have done a video going over the best things about Dead Island 2, and if you're interested in watching that, then a link to that video is on the screen now, and you can go ahead and join me over there.